Cello, I'm Kathy with a K, sometime radio broadcaster in Honolulu. Hawaii POV is a talk story series. My main goal was to just gather up radio folk or radio affiliated people throughout Honolulu and the islands, because people jump from Oahu.
Travel between islands,
yeah. Or in transition. Some people are forever in transition, looking for that next fix of radio.
Radio's been fun.
Yeah.
It's really a fun medium. I mean, when you think about it, you do the same thing. We get paid to entertain people and play music.
We're in one of the conference rooms for
Pacific Media Group. We have stations on the Big Island. We have these stations on Maui. And interesting, you came today. They just announced that we have bought a radio group on the island of Kauai.
Well, today's October 5th, Aloha
Right.
Friday.
Yeah.
Maui County Fair is going on this weekend.
That's going to be that's the big event of the year, really.
I remember when I was going to school in Lahaina, and I was like, "Ooh, the Maui County Fair is happening," because you could check out all the boys from the other schools and stuff, because Lahaina kind of far, you know what I mean? For many seasons, I've heard your name, and I've heard you on the air, and then as I've been very lucky to work in radio, it's the one constant is there is a gig somewhere in the islands, and it's just a matter of being patient for it to present itself, because it's a timing thing. Ed looks way younger in person than anything online.
Thank you.
All
right, that's a great way to start. No, I've been in radio since 1972. The longest that I have been ever unemployed, 3 months probably, early on in my career. I can't even tell you what year it was.
We're going to start in the beginning then.
Okay.
Before we get to Ed Kanoi on the radio, where were you born and raised?
I was born in Tripler Hospital, born and raised in Pearl City. I think we spent some time in Enchanted Lakes, Kailua side. My dad was in the service. After our stay here, he got transferred to a place called Fort Ord, California.
Which branch of the military?
He was in the Army. He was a musician in the Army.
Which instrument?
Saxophone player. Great saxophone player.
Was it like high school, college? He played in band before
He,
going
I
military?
don't know when he started in the band. It's a good question. I never asked my father that. But I remember going to rehearsals at Fort Shafter and watching him play and conduct the band. So I was always around music. We spent some time in Alaska, and then we came back in the late 60s, I think, back to Hawaii. And I think it was about the time the Vietnam War was getting to be really intense. And my stepmother told my dad, because my dad was thinking about going to Vietnam, she said, "Well, if you go to Vietnam, I'm out of here."
Oh, really?
I was starting high school. So I was about 14, 15 years old, getting into high school. Musically, my brother was a drummer, so we were definitely into music. But I remember the Vietnam War, because my dad would watch the news all the time, and you'd have these incredible counts of soldiers that died, and my dad was thinking that he would get sent there, and my mom was putting her foot down, because my dad had been in the Army for a long time. So she said, "No, you're not going to Vietnam." And so my dad decided to retire, and we retired back home. We came back home. My dad played in the military band, so you're doing military music, the marches, those kinds of things. And then my dad was a member of a jazz band.
Right.
So he would go and they would gig at night during the weekends and that kind of thing. So he would practice at home. I would just fall in love with the sound of the saxophone player. I found out later in life that wasn't my gig. That's what he did. He played jazz when he wasn't in the military. My mom loved music. My dad was a musician. We were growing up it was the 60s, so there was a lot of rock and roll, and music was changing. My dad hated rock and roll. My mom loved the Beatles. That was the only thing that she liked. So it was just an appreciation of music. My dad would listen to rock and roll, and he would tell me it's not music. And I think it must have been intermediate school that I could not play the saxophone as good as my father. I didn't realize that he'd been doing that for a long time. Because he would practice in the bedroom, and it would just sound so beautiful, and it never sounded like that when I did it.
Was there other things you were able to connect with him?
I had polio when I was a kid. 1954, there's a big outbreak of polio in the islands. So I spent a lot of time with my father, because he was the one that took me back and forth to the hospital for different things and different appointments. So he and I spent a lot of time together. So I was pretty close. I still am close to my father. He's still alive.
Oh,
Thank
wow.
goodness. Yeah. He's in his 90s, and you know, at least once a month we chat, or, you know, call and check in and stuff.
Is he here in the islands?
He's on Kauai. He's living with my sister on Kauai. So yeah, I've always been really close to my dad. When I got into radio, I think the success of the longevity of my career in radio, I have to attribute to my advice my father gave me. Because when I got into radio, he told me something along the way. He just said, as a performer, performers come and go. He says, what you really want to do is you want to learn how to run things, because that's where your longevity is. So, and I didn't start on the radio as a disc jockey, as a personality. I started in something called a record library, KKUA. I had.
But how did you get into it? How did you first step into a radio station?
My English class at Waipahu High School, my teacher was Mrs. Takahama, who I think is now a principal somewhere in Oahu. She was my English teacher. We were studying contemporary lyrics and the meaning of those lyrics in life.
What is contemporary? Give a kind of a reference point.
Oh, at that point it would have been any of the songs that were on the radio in 1971. We were talking about and looking at lyrics and how they affected our life, and because radio back then was your major form of music entertainment, AM radio, we had a disc jockey visit the classroom, and he came did a talk about radio and what it was, and he invited a bunch of us to the radio station. So we took a trip, and we went to visit a studio. By chance, happened to be a guy that had an accident early on in his life, walked with a cane. I had polio, as I told you, so I was on a cane at that point, and we sort of just hit it off, and we became friends and stayed in touch. Another thing my dad told me when I was young was, because of my physicality, he told me, you're not going to be a soldier, you're not going to be a construction worker, you're going to have to find something to do with your brain, right? That was always in the back of my head. I discovered this radio studio with, you know, it was a horseshoe, the counter, right, with a board and all the controls in front of you, big speaker on the top, blasting, you know, today's hottest music, and a guy basically talking and having fun in the middle of all that. And I went, wow, you guys get paid for this?
It hasn't changed.
You guys get paid to do this? You know, for whatever time you were, and that was their job.
Yeah.
And I instantly fell in love with radio. I just went, I want to do that.
Yeah.
Big problem I had. I was, you know, born and raised in Hawaii, and back in the 60s or the 70s when I discovered radio, everybody on the radio still, even in Hawaii, were from the mainland. Pretty much.
Do you remember who you were listening to back then, or who was on the radio?
Uncle Tom was on the radio. Tom Moffat was the morning guy at K-Poi. There was a bunch of other guys, Emperor Hudson, Gene Davis, who was really a guy that I really learned a lot from. I didn't really have a favorite radio guy growing up. I remember when I lived in Alaska, and Alaska was the place that we lived in before my dad retired, a place called the Bun. It was a drive-in, and the guy was on the roof of the drive-in, glass windows.
My dream.
Glass windows. He would do that.
Have something to talk about.
Yeah, at night you're looking at you're looking at everybody having dinner or partying, teenagers having party. And so I remember those kinds of things about radio. I have, for some reason, remember Uncle Tom's jingle playing on the radio. I don't know why, but I was in Pearl City, and so when I discovered radio, all these things started to come together in my mind. Because I was, you know, not going to be running any races or anything, I was intrigued by the fact that they sat there or stood there in this horseshoe, and that was their job. And it was music, and I grew up loving music, you know, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. I'll tell you a real quick story. When I was a kid, before puberty, you know, your voice changes, my mom's friends would call and I would answer the phone, and I would get so upset because they would go, your daughter has such a wonderful voice.
She sounds so sweet.
Sweet, yes. Your daughter has such a sweet voice. And I would just get so angry. You know, getting into radio back then, it was really difficult because most of the guys were from the mainland. There was a guy named Akapito who was Aku's sidekick, and I think he worked midnight to 6.
And Aku is a KSSK K59.
Yes, yes. He was at one point
in Honolulu,
the highest paid disc jockey in America. They used to, I don't know if you're old enough to remember the fact that the tower where KGMB or KSSK broadcast from used to have his name. At the base of where KGMB TV is, the tower used to be there. Cross Ala Moana, a little bit down from Keomoku, heading
It's like
toward Waikiki.
Atkinson, Kapiolani.
Yeah, between those places.
Kaheka
Was
side.
a radio tower, and that was the KSSK radio tower. And Aku had his name in neon lights
That is amazing.
at the bottom of the tower. Yes.
In a land where billboards are outlawed.
This man had neon lights, AKU, out on the radio tower. So, you know, those are the kind of guys that were happening on the radio. My mom would listen to Aku, my dad would listen to Aku, the kids would listen to Tom Moffat. Because Tom and
that's a K-Poi.
K-Poi,
Okay.
K-Poi, yeah. And then K-Poi had some competition where I started my career was a station called KKUA. A gentleman by the name of Jock Fernhead, who I think at one time owned K-Poi. He was an English gentleman, was from New York, came to Hawaii and started this radio station called KKUA, Top Banana. And that's where I met Scott Edwards. That's where I got my job as a record librarian, which was basically after I got out of school when I was a senior. I had a half-day schedule as a senior. I would catch the bus from Waipahu to Amana Street, and my job at that point was disc jockeys played 45s, singles, and they would play the single and they would put it on a pile in a corner.
Okay. On a spindle or just?
Just in a pile, in a pile, because they had
Men.
covers. We had covers on them so they wouldn't scratch. And there was no computers back then, so basically I was a human computer. I would take that stack of records when I got out of school, I would put it away for 3 days, I would take another stack that's been aged for 3 days and refile them in the studio. That way, a disc jockey, and as we know, we tend to play our favorite songs. That was the safety zone, so disc jockeys wouldn't keep playing the same oldies on their shows. Because I got into Top 40 radio. KKUA was what we call Top 40 radio. You play the same 10 or 15 songs over and over and over again. And I would get a lot of heat from my friends because we were rockers.
Yeah.
But I always said, when we go over to your house and we listen to music, we listen to the same rock records over and over again. Same thing.
Yeah.
It's just a different genre. You know, when we like something, we have a tendency to really like it. Radio understood that because I think the way the story goes is a guy named Tom Storts. They were sitting in a restaurant observing people having a lunch, and people kept playing the same song in a jukebox. And so they decided, well, you know, let's try that formula on radio. And that's basically what I understand is the birth of what we call Top 40 radio. But that's how I got into it. So I was the record librarian.
For how long?
It was from the day I walked into a radio station, it was about 7 years before I was able to get my first weekend job.
Shy.
Weekend job. Spent a lot of time. In fact, Holiday Mart is not there. Is Dae still there?
Oh, you mean Don Quixote?
Don Quixote? Okay, yes.
Yeah.
I spent my first year of radio in the Chinese food line because as the record librarian, I was just this weekend guy. Or a guy came in every so often that did this job. But to be able to hang out with the disc jockeys, I was like, can I get you lunch?
And it's still true. It's just like,
yeah,
earlier I asked Ed Kanoi and Charly, it's like, do you guys want to from the outside the station? It's like, no, and I didn't ask twice. Don't ask twice because they may
They'll say yes.
Yeah.
And when you said that, by the way, I did think about it, going, she's going to be back at noon, it's lunchtime. So I did think about that, but I thought, okay, fine, no, she's on vacation. But yeah, that's how most of us started, doing things for disc, and they would let you hang out, and I would watch.
What were some of the things you remember in those early years before your weekend was live?
That just things moved like that. They were, it was. I mean, we call it fun. We call it fun, and it is fun. But after 4 hours of that kind of movement, you get really tired. But I thought, wow, I can do this. But I spoke pidgin, and back then, the only local radio station was KCCN playing Hawaiian music. That's the only place where locals, except for Agapito, had a job. For the neighbor islands, I guess, because I was in Honolulu, so I wasn't real familiar with what was going on in the neighbor islands. At least in Honolulu, you had to sound like all these guys from the Midwest. It took me a long time to get that down. I would record a commercial, and when the guys had time, they would listen to it and tell me what they thought. And I did that back and forth for, about 7 years before I really got my first full-time job.
Were you always Ed Kanoi?
My real name is Edmund, but a guy that I was hanging out with back then said, you got to be Jay Michaels when you get your weekend job. So that's what I was Jay Michaels. And I would do these, and when I started to do these appearances at the high school dances and stuff like that, Jay Michaels just sounded really like, you don't look like a Jay Michaels. Yeah. So we had to come up with something else. And I fell in love with this lady in high school. Her last name was Kanoi. So that never went anywhere, by the way, but she was just beautiful. And so when things started to change, because my last name is a Filipino last name, hard to say, hard to remember. And again, you're talking about early days of radio. And back then it was, the whole reality of life was a different thing. I was told not to use your real name, and this is what somebody told me, is that if you get arrested for anything, they have your real name, but it won't reflect on on the radio. So I remembered the Vera Kanoi, and I went Ed Kanoi, and I went okay, because I was working at KKUA.
Vera Kanoi. Bless you, Vera. So
wherever you are, Vera, thank you very much. People come up to me every once in a while and go, my uncle says we're related. I go, okay. But we are, thank you. Everybody in Hawaii is related. But yeah, every once in a while that will happen. One of the things I didn't want to do early on is as you know, there's so many stations in Honolulu. And at that time, they were owned independently. So you could go from one station to another station and when you needed a job. I never wanted to do the circle twice. That was one of the things I made up my mind that I wasn't going to do. Yeah, I've never bothered to count up the amount of call letters that I have worked under, but it's quite a list.
Yeah.
Besides the performance part of radio, I started to learn the programming end of radio. A guy named Ron Jacobs, who it basically was one of the pioneers of top 40 radio, the way we know it.
In Honolulu, and then subsequently throughout the U.S.
Yes, he was the program director of K-Poi with Tom Moffat. He was
Mr. Moffat. I'm the only one.
You would call him Mr. Moffat, Uncle Tom, Tom Moffat. Ron Jacobs and Tom worked together at K-Poi. Jacobs was another guy got into radio in high school in Honolulu. Ran into some trouble, ended up on the mainland and doing radio there, and became a monster programmer. Well, when he returned to Honolulu, he came to KKUA. He and the owner, Jock Fernhead, had worked together before at K-Poi. And so I was just this record librarian guy from Waipahu. I had read about Ron in Billboard magazine on the trades, that he had these wonderful ideas about satellite radio and all these wonderful things, mid to late 70s. So he was talking about doing a concert in Minneapolis, and you could watch it in Honolulu and stuff like that. But so I knew the name, and then the next thing I knew, they said that he was going to do the morning show on KKUA. And I went, cool. This is like huge. And I can't remember the circumstances, but he and I ended up talking, and he said, "You're Filipino?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Do you have any Filipino music?" I said, "No." I said, "But my grandmother might have some stuff." He says, "I want you to go and get some Filipino records from your grandmother." He said, "Okay." Got some Filipino records, and I didn't realize, see, I was young, so I didn't realize how huge Ron Jacobs was in Hawaii.
Okay.
And people in radio were going, Ron Jacobs is coming back to Hawaii. What is he going to do?
Yeah.
So I had the privilege of being behind him on that first morning show. And the first bit that he did was he put on some Filipino music and started to do his Filipino accent thing, which he did really well.
He could do so many different
yes,
characters.
He was just crazy. And I stood there as probably a 20-something-year-old person going, wow, you can do this?
This is allowed?
This is radio?
Yeah,
I mean, it was different than the kind of radio that we had been doing before. And so I had the privilege of those first early years of being his gopher. His, the guy that stood behind him and got him his coffee and helped him find stuff or whatever the case may be. So I learned a lot sitting behind him. I eventually became a programmer under Ron and got into management and specifically music because that was my interest. And then learning, how to program a radio station and its music. So most of my career was in management and doing shifts that other guys didn't do.
Overnights,
Weekends.
weekends.
Yes, that kind of stuff. Because my main job was as a programmer. I really put a lot of time into studying how to make those things happen and what went into that. How I got into morning radio was an interesting story because Ron was a Rams fan.
Okay.
Los Angeles Rams,
okay.
when they were in Los Angeles the first time. Because he was working in KHJ and went to every game and all that stuff. So he came home, he would watch the games. Whenever the Rams would lose, now you have to understand Ron was a fanatic. If they lost on that Sunday, he would go absolutely bonkers to the point where he would call his program director, me, and go, "I'm not coming in. Blankety blank Rams."
Oh gosh.
That's where Charly and I got together because Charly at that point, we were at KDO Radio. Charly was his news person, and I was the program director of the station that we started.
Charly Espina.
Charly Espina, Takahama now, but she was the news person, and I would have to come in every Monday to do Ron's show because the Rams were having a terrible season.
How many years did they have terrible seasons?
For a while, I got to do morning radio a lot back in those KDO radio days, and that's how I eventually got into doing morning radio. But just being there, it was crazy.
What was he like when they won?
Ron was just the exact opposite. Ron was a genius. He was a radio genius. He wasn't a great people person. I spent a lot of my programming career using the things that he taught me about how to do good radio and what goes into good radio, and then doing the exact opposite of how he treated people. He was a screamer. Ron would call, he was a perfectionist. Ron was a Virgo. He was very proud of that. And so am I. But he would, my first wife would tell you, he would call at 4:30 in the morning when he got to KKUA, and if things were out of place, in the studio, the setup wasn't just right, he would be on the phone to his program director and letting me know how unhappy he was. This would be 4:30 in the morning. So I lived a lot of my life at KKUA learning, and my whole thing with Ron doing that episode of my life was yell at me. You asked me about that. You said, "How do you survive so long?" And you said, "Did you keep saying yes?" Well, no. I didn't keep saying yes. I just made a decision. You can yell at me all you want, as long as you're teaching me something about what we're doing. Then I can put up with the craziness. And that's, because my relationship with Ron really changed one day when he was on the radio making fun of Melvine Lead, who he was really good friends with. He grew up with her, making fun of her because she was doing Aku's show.
Oh, the competition.
Oh, okay. She was doing the competition show.
Yeah.
He was really upset, and he let everybody know it on the radio. And I was his program director, and he goes, and we would always talk, "How's it sound? How's it sound? How's it sound? What's going on? How's it sound?" And I remember that moment where I went, "Really? She's over there. They're listening to you. Do they really care that she's over there? And you're going off just bringing attention to it. Come on." And at that moment, our relationship changed. Because I finally stood up and went,
"Brah."
"Brah, really? Come on. Cut it out. Just do your gig. You're great. You know what you're doing. Just do the gig." A thing I learned as a young disc jockey, you're only as good as your last show.
Yeah.
Talking
or
about
break.
wandering around, right? Wandering around looking for a job, because if and it was a little different then, because everybody was looking to get into radio. So if you weren't going to do your job right and learn how to do it, somebody was there ready to back you up and take it. So the performance part of it was just, you're always on edge. You know, you're always trying to get better. Kamasami Kong. Because everybody says, how do I sound today? How do I, you know, and yeah, you sound great, right? You know, isn't that the normal passing of the torch, as we used to call it? I was the midnight to 6 guy. He was the 7 to midnight guy. So we would cross every night, and we made a decision early in our careers as friends, when we say, how does it sound, to be very critical of each other, you know, and what can I do better? Check. Yeah. And then we would sit at the bottom of the radio station when we could have some time together and listen to each other's air checks and go, wow, you know, that was great, man, that's fantastic, you know, or this could be done better, or this is my programmer coming out of me. Don't listen after you do an air check. Wait a day, because every mistake that you make, that you remember when you walk out of that studio, if you listen to yourself immediately, you will feel it in your body.
Yeah. Actually, a lot of the time when I get a chance to listen back, see, I'm talking to you as a program, as if we're in an air check meeting. Okay, so you know, I had a lot on my mind last week. But it's true. About a week later,
you listen to it.
Even like a year ago, I'm just like, what? I was in a good space 6 months ago.
Exactly.
I didn't know why I was beating myself up.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you still have a tape from your first?
I don't anymore. I used to. But in the moves that we do as radio people, that somewhere went away. But when I listened to that first one, I remember going, how did I get a job? What did they hear? There's a performance line that you have to reach on a daily basis. It takes a lot to do that. Not everybody can do that, you know, as far as getting up, whether you're doing mornings or afternoons or whatever. But walk into that studio and hit that level of entertainment and knowledge of what's going on in the world, and put all those things together into, you know, a little microphone. It took some training to do that. You know, with me, it's invest whatever time you're on the road here on Maui, invest it with us. You know, and so you have to take that seriously. You can't just, so every break is, you know, you put some thought into it. I mean, if you're doing it long enough, it's not as critical. I mean, you can get by sometimes, but still, I approach every morning I wake up going, I get a chance to go in there and play and make people laugh and play some good music for them. You know, they're stuck in traffic. I'm not. So it's a privilege. I look at it as a real privilege, and to be able to do that. Still do this. Spend 40-something years of doing this.
I can edit it. It'd be like 2 years.
Just beep that out, would you? Put a beep right there. But I still get up to this day excited about doing this job. You know, to the point where I've set up a studio in my house, and when I go home after this gig, I'll go do commercials for the internet and try to get more work there. I mean, it's just, I just found it to be a very satisfying career. When was this? The early 80s, maybe? We changed KDO from a adult contemporary station to the country, to when it became a country station.
And that's where I am familiar with it, because it was low broadcasting.
Right.
And I remember the TV commercial where people would be in an office and then they turn into Paniolo gear. One of my
the
favorite
westernmost country station in the nation.
A little bit of country and everybody, KDO
yes,
radio.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was a homemade jingle, by the way. But the guy that came in to install the country music format came from LA, a company called Drake Chenault. I was the program director, so I was responsible to Ron to get us through this transition. Ron had already told me that after we go country, because I was not a country person, only thing I knew about country at that point was that whenever my dad and mom had friends over, military friends over at night, they would sing Tammy Wynette. And I just would go, oh gosh. But that's all I knew about country. So Ron said, you know, you're going to be out of a gig after this is over. after this transition. For me, it was the first time I had dealt with automation. It meant that Ron Jacobs was going to be the morning guy, but we were going to automate the station without any disc jockeys. After that, I would be out of a job. So I said, okay, but I've learned to work and get the job done. And so I kept my head up and pulled off, doing the transition. Well, that got the notice of the gentleman that came in to put in the format. So he asked Ron, what's happening to this kid? Because I was still young. He says, he's going to be out of a job after we moved to country. He says, oh, let me talk to him. And they brought me to LA for about a year, Los Angeles. And I just started to miss the everyday workings of radio. Drake Chenault was a production company. We were working with radio stations, but I didn't do a radio show, and I was the operations manager for Drake Chenault. At that time, we had 6 or 7 different formats. They were all on reel-to-reel. You had an office of programmers that decided what music needed to go onto these reels that were shipped out to the radio station. You had engineers that would record those songs onto a tape. You had a shipping department, ship those tapes to the radio stations, and you had a complaint department. And if something went wrong, you had to contact those radio stations. I was the operations guy for that. Kind of oversaw that whole thing, and I did that for about a year, but I started to miss radio.
Good money, but...
Yeah, it wasn't just live radio, and I started to make some calls in and around the LA area. My son was 5 years old at that point, 5 or 6 years old, and I remember, and this is really weird, but I remember standing in Los Angeles at a street corner, and next to my son and I was the newspaper boxes. But the next box that was next to it was the porn box.
Oh gosh!
And all the porn magazines were there right there on the corner. And I just remember thinking to myself how exciting and beautiful LA was and the things that were there, but how I could not protect my son from exposing him to that stuff if it was going to be right there. That I would do a better job of raising him back in Hawaii. So I came back.
Aren't you glad that you're not raising a kid now with the internet?
Well, I am raising 2 kids now, and it's really a battle. Yeah, I have 2 more kids. One's 13 and going to be 14, and the other's going to be 11.
When you think about the various radio stations you've worked at, we don't have to go through all the calls, but are there a few moments, maybe promotions or talents, interviews?
Gosh, my time with Ron is probably the biggest moments of my life, because I learned so much about being a programmer, watching, what we call, at least what I call anyway, controlled chaos. Radio that you kind of didn't want to get out of your car if he was in the middle of a break doing something. You wanted to hear the end of it. To how to generate that kind of listening. So I learned a lot about that watching Ron work. For me, one of the most creative times as a jock, I spent time on Kauai with my partner, became Ed Kanoi from Booga Booga.
Yes. How did that happen? So it's on Kauai.
Oh, it's on Kauai.
Yeah.
The hurricane had hit.
Which one?
Hurricane Aniki. Hurricane Aniki had hit. And I was supposed to be married that day, by the way. That's a whole different.
Wow.
Yeah.
The signs, yeah.
I was supposed to get married that day, and Hurricane Aniki. That obviously didn't happen until 3 days later. But the island was devastated. And a year later, after doing radio, after we recovered from, maybe it was even less than a year, my boss coming up to me and says, we really have to do something. We have to figure out, how to get the island on its feet, how to make it feel better. And we had both worked with a guy named Frank B. Shaner. Frank's a really good radio entertainer. Well, I said, let's call Frank. And so we did. We brought Frank to Kauai. Frank's a big city boy and would show up at my house with a bottle of wine every night after he finished his show and go, I need something to do. And so we would talk radio and do different things, but he just couldn't handle it. It was just too small for Frank. So that lasted a year. So I had to go back as the programmer to do the afternoon show and try to replace Frank B. Shaner, which is very difficult. I was doing that for a while, and I went, I've got to do something. Well, I knew that living on Kauai was Ed Kanoi. He was working for the cable company. He moved to Kauai for some reason. I'm not sure why he moved there, but he was there. In fact, he was there before I had gotten there. So he was there, and I know I'd seen some shows that he was doing on the cable company, the local cable company there. He and I got together, and I said, let's do a show and see where it goes, and maybe I can convince my boss to hire you, and we can both do a show. Now, you have to imagine, back in those days, you know, radio still, expenses, the bottom line is still an important part of it. So Ed and I thought, okay, we'll do a show together. I said, well, come on down and we'll do this gig. There was some big golf tournament that was going on the island. So I brought Ed into the studio, and we kind of looked at each other and talked about, you know, different things. Ed came up with being a reporter for this golf tournament. His vantage point was inside the hole.
That's so clever.
So he was talking like this, doing a report from the 18th hole. But he was doing this report from inside the holes, and my boss, after the show, called us or talked to us, and he said, that was the funniest thing I've ever heard. We both smiled and went, let's do this, you know? And that was the birth of what we called the Ed and Ed Afternoon Luau. Ed, again, being a comedian, I was his straight guy. The radio medium was different for him, so I would set things up. But he was so creative and so funny. I mean, Kauai is so, I mean, you can fit everybody on the island in Aloha Stadium and have leftover seats. So we became a big deal in that small little community. But we had fun. We would just do all kinds of, we took, I remember reading something about comedy being the exact opposite of what people would expect. And radio back then would use these big voiced announcers. You know, you're listening to Ed and Ed or whatever, you know, that kind of stuff. So I had an idea, and we had this old Filipino lady that was our accountant at Kong Radio. And I thought, oh, wow, let's see if we can get her to read stuff for us. So we got her in the studio, and we wrote this little piece about, you know, the boy, coming up next, it's the boys, Ed and Ed, and that kind of stuff. And she became a celebrity. She was our announcer.
Do you remember her?
Auntie Connie. Oh. Auntie Connie was her name. And she was our announcer for the Ed and Ed Afternoon Luau.
Did she become like bigger than?
On Kauai, she was a big deal. People loved her because we would feed her things like, you know, just little pieces of philosophy that she would do in her old Filipino accent. Was just wonderfully funny. And so, yeah, that was the most creative time I've had in radio. And then Ed had the crazy idea, because I'm a radio guy.
Yeah.
I sit in a little tiny room, padded, by the way. Padded rooms.
It's not by accident.
Yes, exactly.
Totally by design.
They don't let us have sharp things, and with a microphone. But Ed, being a member of Booga Booga, went, you know, we have to do a stage act. I went, what do you mean? He goes, we're going to take this show on stage.
Wait, so before that, had Booga Booga kind of like retired without?
Retired.
Was it like an official retirement, or was it just quietly just less shows?
The guys had gone their separate ways. They were still friends. I think rap at that point had passed on. Rap had passed on. Jimmy was still in Honolulu doing different things. Benton. Yeah, Jimmy Benton. So Ed was living on Kauai, and he said, we've got to do a stage thing and do this because we can make some money doing that.
Ooh. Lean in.
Yes. What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? And so we actually put together a two-man thing, and Ed, of course, being the crazy person. And you know, I don't know if you ever met him, but Ed's a big.
No.
He's about 6 feet, but he has a higher voice than I do, and I'm the little guy with a big voice. And so we were opening up. We did Vegas. I think we did Maui. We did Honolulu, and I think we did the Big Island.
Now those, I'm sure you have reels and tapes of performances.
I don't think we do. I don't think we taped it. Phones weren't a big deal.
What about, did you ad-lib it, or everything was scripted? There must be some manuscript somewhere.
Well, I was a radio guy, so I needed to sort of have a script. I needed to know there was a plan. Whatever you plan in rehearsal, Ed would walk up on that stage, read the crowd, and go off on whatever direction he needed to go in. And it was usually nowhere near what we had rehearsed, except for maybe a couple of structured bits. I think we used to do, we'd always end up with a tribute to rap. What was I like a cheeseburger, French fries, and a thick, and I played the holiday guy.
The hotel
Yes,
skit, yeah.
yes, we did that. Ed would end that, so I knew we would get there. But Ed taught me as a stage performer, he would just say, because I would go, Ed, we're not even close. And he taught me to listen. He says, all you have to do, no matter what we do, is listen to me, then you'll know how to react. Because that was my job, basically.
That's improv.
The
improv
world, yes.
And
as a radio guy, I hadn't done any theater acting or in high school or any of that kind of stuff. So I didn't realize that, but he was the guy that opened my eyes to that whole acting and that stage presence. Well, I've done country. We created a jazz pop music format. We were the first people to, and I was part of the team that put together, the first time you heard Gabby and Joni Mitchell together on FM radio was, you called it the Q, it was 93 QFM. But we were the first person to put Gabby, with the help of Ron Jacobs, Gabby and Joni Mitchell, that pop soundings with some great Hawaiian music. And we did it on FM, and that was the first time anybody heard Gabby in stereo, on the radio, and it was like,
well, his voice really does. Currently in 2018, the Morning Kiss, you're doing a program.
I was running a radio station. I was the general manager of a group of stations on Kauai, and doing that for my second tour of Kauai. Charly called and said, my partner is leaving. I need a partner. Do you want to come to Kauai? And I'm a single dad, so I was raising my two boys, who at that point were probably 7 and 5, and needed Daddy a lot. And Daddy was getting up at 3:30 in the morning and doing a morning show, and then taping another show, and doing commercials, and then doing management, and then picking them up because of the after-school program at 4:30, trying to feed them, and I'm a terrible cook. And then trying to be a dad till 8 o'clock at night, and said, we got to go to bed. So that's what I did that for 3 years. And when Charly called, and she said, they don't need a programmer, they need a morning guy. And that affects you financially. Yeah. But at that point, I looked at it and I went, my children are more important than the money I need to make. I can figure out ways to survive. And so I was on the next plane out. And and we've been doing this for 3 years now, and having a lot of fun.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Great studio.
It's a closet.
No, I'm telling you, it's a great studio because it has exactly what you need.
It's a small studio, and we do a morning show from 6 to 10 because of our tenure. Charly's been around for a long time. They pretty much leave us alone and let us, grow where we want to go and that kind of thing. So from a radio standpoint in 2018, it's an ideal situation. Yeah. I hope my program director is not listening, but this morning was the birthday of one of the guys in AC/DC. And so we played AC/DC. He shook me all night long.
I think everyone was playing AC/DC
this morning. Good. And we backed it up with, I don't know, Biba Rexha. Okay. So, and I think to myself, that's a pretty amazing segue. It's a pretty amazing set, but they let you do it. And there's not many opportunities where you can do that and have that kind of fun. And so, yeah.
And that's key, it's fun.
It's fun, it's still fun. I've always told myself the minute that it stops becoming fun, because I've been doing it for a while, then it would be time to think about doing something else. But so far, I still get up at 3:30 in the morning.
But not for work. It's just I wake up at 3:30. Just praise the Lord!
I get up at 3:30 in the morning, get on my computer, see what's going on in the world, see what the news has to offer, see what things people are talking about, put all that together, and we meet before 6 o'clock and we go at it 5 days a week.
You're not going to retire.
I really didn't have a plan to retire.
How about back in 1972 when you were a record librarian? A record sorter. Did you have any long range? Not
really. I grew up the 70s were a very different culture. Yeah, drugs played a big deal in the culture of people that grew up in the 70s, and they'll tell you that. And I remember my mom telling me, and I think this is a Hawaiian thing, is live for today, don't worry about tomorrow. That kind of attitude. So I had a lot of that attitude as a young man. So no, I didn't really have any long range plans, really. things started to change after you get married and have children and those kinds of things. But radio has always been fun. This part of my career, I'm really interested in the voiceover business and still being able to use my voice to generate income. So been looking at, working in that arena a lot when I'm not doing this. So what I do every day is very satisfying. It's so wonderful when somebody will come up to you out of nowhere and just go, I didn't hear the answer to that question. You know what, it's a funny story is, and I called, Charly and I weren't working together. We worked together early on in our career, and then we went our separate ways. And I remember being at some event, and I had to call her, because we always talk to each other, at least on birthdays, we'd call. I remember calling her one day, because some guy approached me at an event, or someplace I was, and went, brah, you was on KKUA radio about 10, 15 years ago, and you did a question. And I had to grab a beer, and I missed the answer.
Shut it down.
Do you know what the answer was? And I looked at him going, what? So, those kinds of moments.
What was it?
I have no idea. I said, bro, you got to give me some clues. At this point, I don't remember what I ate for breakfast yesterday.
Charly told me to tell you she had sent the guy over. No, I'm kidding.
But, you get things like that. I mean, there were moments, we did a bit, KDO, it was April Fool's Day, and we cut a recording that played every hour that said we had appreciated the fact that country music fans had listened to the radio station for a long time. But starting tonight at midnight, there was going to be a change. And we were going to do all Boy George radio with makeup tips and that kind of stuff. And so this thing ran every hour on April Fool's Day. Well, 6 months later, I'm having dinner with a friend of mine at Camp Smith, and somebody comes up to us and says, hey, you're Ed Kanoi. Yes. He says, you have a real fan over here that really wants to say hi. I said, okay, fine. So she comes over and she goes, Mr. Kanoi, if you ever mess with my country music format again and do that Boy George thing, and I was like, and it was like 6 months later. And so it's, I mean, Michael will appreciate this. I had a conversation with somebody just a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the old radio days, and she grew up with KKUA, and she told me, and I don't even remember this, I mean, it's in there but somewhere, but she told me that her memory of radio was when Michael W. Perry lost the W. It was a jingle. It would be a jingle would be singing Michael W. Perry, right? And then I don't know where Michael came, because I was just still a kid, but Michael came up with the idea that he would lose the W. So when Michael Perry, and he made a big deal. Where's my W? Where's it gone? And the afternoon guy, a guy named Lou Richards, had the W in his jingle.
That's hot.
And
That's so great.
It was this battle that was going on, your imagination. Right. But this girl that it's 2018, that happened in the 70s. One of her memories is when Michael W. Perry lost his W.
That's so great.
I mean,
this is the fun of radio.
This is the fun of radio, you know.
And it's the accessibility, because you get into your car, you're in your bedroom, or taking a shower. In the
best thing I heard about radio,
waiting room.
Ron Jacobs told me, he said, radio is the lowest rung on the entertainment ladder. Therefore, Ed, it's closest to the people. And I've always remembered that.
Lone tier, hashtag.
I've always remembered that. Well, yeah, so it's been a wonderful career. And if you're listening, if you've been listening, thank you. Appreciate it.